Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week is one of our very rare call-outs to action in regards to golden rice in an attempt to, persuade via petition to have the anti-GMO decisions in the Philippines overturned, which, while unlikely to work, is at least somewhat more useful. Ozempic's relationship to pregnancy, forever chemicals and damages to your renal system. HIV has reached its lowest point since the first major outbreaks of the 1980s. Nasal sprays slow down Alzheimer's disease progression, albeit in a very limited animal study. Alternative cancer treatments are not just pointless, but arguably dangerous with regards to public health. Death from cervical cancer, on the other hand, does continue to fall sharply, and most notably since we started issuing the HPV vaccine. A callback to the 1980s, OCD, and a case study involving a surprising surgery using a Smith & Wesson. The productivity of agriculture has seen drastic increases, especially in some areas, over the last 60 years, and you may be amazed to see just how much so. Plastic-eating insects discovered in Africa. An impossible bond which breaks the 100-year-old rule regarding the ability of different elements to make connections. Machine learning, racism, and economics. The inclusion of pronouns and the effect this has on other people's perception of you, particularly in regards to universities. How university graduation rates have shifted significantly based on your sex. And a interesting encounter online regarding autism and whether or not it's a neurological condition or a psychological condition. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with the call out to action that we mentioned. That is, there is currently a petition circulating from weplanet.org. It's essentially asking people to sign their name to it and make it clear, to the Philippines High Court that no, the anti-GMO laws that exist and the various rulings are nonsense. They shouldn't have been applied, and in doing so, you are effectively leading to not only the death of children, but heart conditions, loss of eyesight, and other medical problems that not only are avoidable, but arguably incredibly easily prevented with an otherwise perfectly safe rice strain. You'll find a link to this below, but do note that although it's rare, this is something we very much encourage you to have a look at. Next, we have something called dark genes. Now, dark genes is a rather silly name, much like, say, a Death Star. It's nowhere near the size of a star, and it's, capable of death, but then again, any star could do that, so it's not really all that helpful. But what we're talking about here by talking about a dark gene is rather that it's a hard to detect and apply sequence of DNA that, because of what it does and how little it produces, both in volume and size of proteins, we don't know what they're doing, or at least we haven't until now. And since so much of the genome as we know it is considered junk DNA, that being DNA for which we don't know its purpose, and it's likely to have one, the genome isn't just packed full of random DNA for no reason, this would be an example of junk DNA. A relatively simple and easy example of this is long non-coding RNA. This is RNA created by copying one half of a DNA strand. This long non-coding RNA then has a variety of functions. It can lead to the modification of how a gene is expressed. It can lead to the modification of how various proteins are post-processed after they're first transcribed or translated, and there are a range of other things it can do beyond just being a random bit of RNA produced from a seemingly random bit of DNA. However, this is where we get to the, let's call it crux of the problem with this particular study. It has not been peer-reviewed. It is very much a preprint publication, and as such, some of its claims are going to be mighty speculative, and especially likely to, encounter pushback from many reviewers. The research has, for all intents and purposes, argued that this dark DNA region, or dark genes, are areas that code for very short polypeptides, that is, short proteins, which then have various functions in other ways. Now, for example, the blockage of or modification of certain other functions within a cell. Like many such novel discoveries, the researchers claim that they could have relevance in all kinds of biomedical aspects. For example, cancer and how it can or cannot happen, stopping it, various devices and conditions, immunology, and so on. Whether or not this actually holds true is going to be a very different story and far more interesting if, and that is the big if here, the research gets past a peer review. In other peptide-related news, we have Ozempic, but Ozempic for several reasons. The first of these is let's say, situation called Ozempic babies. Essentially, use of Ozempic is being linked to a significant increase in pregnancy, and, well, obviously in females, given that, well, females get pregnant and males are required for that to happen. The question here is several-fold, and the first is simply, is it because Ozempic itself is contributing to the pregnancy? That Ozempic, due to its effect on losing weight, is leading to an increased probability of pregnancy, given that obesity and being overweight are both linked to reduced probability of not only getting pregnant, but being able to sustain a pregnancy, whether or not various metabolic conditions are related to this, and therefore Ozempic is helping to mitigate those, and other problems again. So it's not just that Ozempic is leading to greater pregnancy. However, the research, or at least, let's say, evidence into this so far, indicates that that is definitively not the only case. There's certainly a very important condition to consider, or conditions more likely, but still, it's been argued that individuals on both Ozempic and the oral contraceptive pill still become pregnant, which, yeah, that's a slight concern. The first possible explanation, and this is arguably the most likely at this stage, is simply that the GLUT receptors, or glucagon-like peptide receptors in this case, are likely, and understand this is again somewhat nebulous, interfering with the absorption of the oral contraceptives and therefore making it less effective. It certainly needs far more evidence to definitively state if that is the case, but it is far more likely than other, let's say, variables at present. And of course, having to mention a hot button issue, we need to reassure you that the evidence from clinical trials so far looking at Ozempic and other glucagon-like peptides indicates that even if you do become pregnant while using it, there are relatively no indications of any major congenital malformations in the baby, so long as you're on the peptide, in this case, or drug. There's also other issues regarding Ozempic, and, well, it's very simple. There is a push to use supplements to achieve the same thing. Now, it's not to say that there aren't arguably some that could achieve a vaguely similar result. However, the big difference here is vaguely similar doesn't necessarily mean the same mechanisms and certainly not the same benefits. This is why you need to not only make sure of what you're taking, but be sure that what you are taking is actually what you think it is. After all, a lot of supplements are not regulated, which, as you can imagine, taking an unregulated product in lieu of a regulated product is kind of like trusting that the yellow snow cone you are given is actually lemon-flavored snow and not something else. Assuming that your source of supplements in various kinds, whether it's psyllium husk, green tea extract, berberine, taurine, chromium, and so on, are actually what you think they are, they're still not going to be as effective as glucagon-like peptides. Although not as effective, they are at least a temporary measure that can be used, particularly in the current environment, where occasionally getting things like Ozempic is just not possible. In other chemical-related news, although this time arguably a better justified examination of chemicals, we have things like PFAS. These are otherwise known as forever chemicals and are properly called the polyfluoroalkyl substances. Essentially chemicals that once again in your body will build up over time, but in theory you should never really have very much build up in your body. The concern from this study is rather simple. The circulating forever chemicals, those PFASs, can cause damage to your kidneys, and the kidneys are rather important. You can get away with losing one in theory. Of course, having one is never a good idea because if that breaks down, well, you have no kidneys. If you have two kidneys, Well, even if one goes wrong, there's always a backup. And of course, there's always the notion of whether or not you want to donate, but in any case, the damage is going to be a concern, because as you get older, the function of your kidneys goes down, and this means anything that impairs function is bad. This is where an examination both has its strengths and weaknesses. The first and arguably biggest issue is that although, yes, they did have 78 participants, and it was a somewhat mixed cohort, that is, of different ethnicities and ages, that is ages 17 and 22, it was a predominantly Hispanic cohort, which does create some concerns around sample selection issues. The lack of diversity is in this case a weakness. There were 7 different forever chemicals, or PFASs, that they became concerned about because they were exposed at the start of the trial. And what they found was at the end of the 4 or so years of the study, there was a roughly 2.4% drop in creatine production from the kidneys, which that's an indicator that the kidneys aren't behaving the way they should. The researchers do try and argue that although these chemicals have been phased out of most cookware and similar in the USA, the toxic effects may still be present and carrying through from the early 2000s. The second issue, which is arguably far more concerning as far as the claims made, and arguably far less sustainable as far as the claims made, is that the PFAS, or forever chemicals, are affecting your microbiome in your gut. That is, the bacteria in your small intestine for the most part. However, that claim is based on stool samples from 45 participants, roughly 2/3 of the individuals involved in the study. So yeah, you've artificially, in a manner of speaking, selected a subset without being able to really say if that subset reflects a real-world difference. The other issue with this is that although they were able to explain 33% of the reduced kidney function from these forever chemicals, and up to half from another group of bacteria, that still leaves a large portion of it unexplained, which does identify that there's a pretty big gap somewhere in their study design. Of course, there's a very simple way to remove certain things from your, well, in this case, drink, and particularly drinking water. And if you want to remove microplastics, well, it's, as said, quite easy, or at least according to Chinese researchers. All you need to do is one thing: boil your water. By then pouring the boiled water through some sort of filtering device, you're able to remove up to 90% of these plastics. The reason this happens is somewhat simple, and that is, the boiling process causes those plastics to denature, they then reaggregate and then fall to the bottom of your vessel. And then because they're somewhat larger and more solid, you can filter them out. It's not exactly rocket science. Well, it's actually chemistry in this case. But the point stands. There is one catch to all of this, and that is the best results were obtained by doing this in hard tap water. That is, water that's already got a higher amount of minerals in it, primarily things like calcium carbonate. The reason for this is partly down to the chemistry of what we're talking about. Calcium helps, and to a certain extent adds to the cross-linkages and therefore precipitation of these plastics. If you're instead using soft water, that is water with very little calcium carbonate by comparison, you get about a quarter of the microplastics that are removed, which is significantly less, but still better than removing none at all. We also want to bring you back to the point around using some sort of strainer. Now, you don't actually need to use a filtering device. You can literally use stainless steel mesh, something like, for example, tea leaves or similar, because that actually works just as well, given the nature of what you're doing. You should, however, be mindful of then how you get rid of the microplastic. Far more, let's say, positive news, assuming that you aren't HIV positive, is that, well, HIV has hit the lowest point of new infections since the 1980s, according to the United Nations. Now, this does mean if you're HIV positive, your clique will be shrinking over time as people die. If you're not HIV positive, it means that people who are both getting tested, they're wearing protection, and they're of course following the various steps required to minimize the possibility of spreading it, all of which are good things. That doesn't mean that things are great though. After all, there are about 630,000 deaths from AIDS-related illnesses just in 2023. Now, this is the lowest point since 2004, but despite the fact it continues to go down, that's still a lot of people dying. And of course, there's 40 million people who will, at some point, given the current situation, die from HIV, and at least a quarter of them are not getting any kind of treatment for their condition. There is some other, let's say, a silver lining to this situation. That is, at least one drug is currently available after clinical trials that seems to have a nearly perfect protection rate for HIV. Now, this drug, called lenacapavir by Gilead, is, let's say, challenging to get. In the USA, it costs about $40,000 per person per year for the drug. But Gilead has agreed to work with generic drug manufacturers in other countries to be able to make it at a significantly lower cost. And by significantly, we mean you don't need to sell your firstborn to a mythical being or some sort of eldritch god in order to be able to afford it. You would probably be able to get away with most normal expenses. It wouldn't be as bad as some other drugs that are out there. Thinking of insulin drugs. Nonetheless, this isn't a solution in all cases because, well, in places like America, where you have an ass-backwards medical system, and insurers tend to be very strange about all kinds of things, you're likely paying this out of pocket, at least for now and likely going on into the future. Of course, that isn't the only news this week that's at least somewhat useful, and somewhat is used with a huge caveat or asterisk next to it, because it's research claiming that just one enzyme may help reverse the effect of Alzheimer's, and any time you see a headline that reads, "Just one thing will prevent a disease that's been stumping scientists for years," you basically have to think bullshit. More so when you really can't necessarily translate the research from mice, as is the case, to humans. The research is looking at tau proteins particularly, and therefore any protein is going to have to look at not only how you make them, but how you break them down, because these tau proteins create neurofibrillary tangles, essentially tangles that prevent the neuron from being able to communicate properly, and therefore the neuron can't really do its job, or at least it can't pass on the message that it needs to do its job. The researchers believe an enzyme called tyrosine kinase 2, or TYK2, is primarily responsible for this, as what it does is add a small tag to the tau proteins which prevent them from being broken down properly. This does eventually lead to the buildup of the tau protein, and the protein becomes all jumbled together with others of its kind, and this creates your problem. But, and this is the big but here, tau protein comes in harmful and non-harmful forms. It is used in other ways in the brain, and so blocking that particular enzyme, as the researchers did, led to a decrease in both essentially the pathological and non-pathological versions of tau. You might now be thinking, the researchers are in their lab going, "Okay boys, we've got the cure for Alzheimer's. Let's get it into people and start testing." But no. The problem, first of all, is that in order to inhibit the TYK2 gene itself, which is what's going to stop that enzyme from being made, you need to effectively find a way to get into the brain, and therein lies the big challenge. The blood-brain barrier is very effective at what it does at preventing things from getting into the brain, and to an extent getting out from the brain, but its primary job is to prevent things from getting in, normally pathogens, but also medication and other treatments. So for now, it's a target for gene therapies and certainly possibly pharmacological therapies, but we don't know yet. While waiting on that research to pan out to some degree, we instead have other research that says essentially a nasal spray might help slow down the progress of Alzheimer's. However, again, animal-based studies, so translating to humans, who knows? This could well turn out to be a red herring, and we're basically going down the garden path following a white rabbit. And whether or not we wind up in a nightclub, or in a weird zany world with a pedophilic author, who knows? The link is based on a fairly simple thing, that is, research that links the essentially a sense of smell to Alzheimer's as a condition. And so, let's say Milanese researchers were trying to figure out if they could use a nasal spray to arguably increase the brain's ability to clear out those tau bundles. Where the previous research was looking at TYK2, this instead looks at another, let's say, enzyme. This enzyme itself is called S-acetyltransferase, and what it does is essentially very much the same. That is, it has a big role to play in the production of various long peptides and ultimately bundles. And by interfering with its function, that being the active ingredient in this nasal spray, they were able to prevent it from essentially building up as quickly, and in some cases allow for the breakdown of those bundles or tau bundles. This means that they could, to an extent, and understand this is based on rodent-based models, slow down the neurodegeneration, which sounds like it's promising, but sounds like and will be promising are very different. If you're sick of hearing about Alzheimer's news, well, too bad. We have the final Alzheimer's piece of news this week for you at least, and it's brain autopsies reveal another possible culprit behind it, which means in this one video you now have 3 for the price of 1. 3 different causes of Alzheimer's disease in one video. We're incredibly generous like that. What this research has found instead is whether it's the microglia that are at least somewhat responsible. They were using single nucleus RNA sequencing to be able to look at 10 different clusters of the microglia in the brain tissue of individuals who donated their brain to science. And so they wanted to know what these microglia did, and if the clusters they were looking into had any responsibility for what's happened. Now, 3 of the clusters that they discovered were relatively novel in this respect. However, only one of those 3 appeared to be more common, and understand we say more common with a massive asterisk, in Alzheimer's disease. And so it would indicate that whatever's going on in these microglia genetically does appear to be involved in not just inflammation, but cell death, which is part of what happens with Alzheimer's disease. There is also another fairly major caveat that the researchers frankly admit to. That is, they don't know for sure whether or not the microglia in the brain that they are looking at as it is in the state where it's most actively involved in the development of things like dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And so they might find that certain genetic activity changes at different stages of development of Alzheimer's. Therefore, they can only really say at the end stage of Alzheimer's disease, effectively when someone dies, this is what's going on genetically in microglia. But in an earlier stage, it might be different again, and the change over time could be more significant in that respect. That is the response from them a pathology, or to a certain extent, a pathophysiology of the underlying Alzheimer's disease? Is it a symptom of the Alzheimer's disease, or is it some weird mixture of these two? In the next major health-related item, we have just how dangerous it is to not only endorse, but spread the various quackery regarding cancer treatments. Essentially, that person from high school you've never spoken to until suddenly they contact you, and you just know they're about to start trying to sell you on a pyramid scheme. Well, their nonsense is arguably a problem, because it's not only a danger when it comes to cancer treatment, but public health as a whole. Understand, the longer you put off treating cancer, the harder it becomes. It's really simple in that respect. If you have a small cluster of cancer cells, you can have a targeted treatment, whether it's surgery, radiation, or just chemotherapy. If you have cancer everywhere in your body, well, you basically either have to irradiate your whole body, which doesn't end well, or you end up becoming some sort of Marvel superhero, or you end up having to have multiple surgeries, long-term chemo, and all sorts of other issues. So putting it off, bad, but treating it early, good, unless you choose to use some sort of ridiculous quackery. And this is where things like allied health, complementary and alternative medicine, just alternative medicine, various other bullshit terminology, all of these will not help you, and instead they add to the burden borne in treating cancer. And of course, the longer someone needs to be treated for, the more they tie up medical resources, whether it's the oncologist, surgical rooms, the various staff required to deal with you both before and after, drugs, your own time and health and well-being, all of this. This is where we come back to the various quackery and pyramid schemes that are out there. Of course, not all of them are, but a lot of them, if they want to call themselves multi-leveling marketing, are. If they don't openly admit they're a pyramid scheme, they will describe their hierarchy as oddly pyramid-shaped. But in other cases, it's literally just a snake oil salesman. And so when they come out of the closet and try and predate upon people, they try and sell their own special kind of pseudoscientific bullshit snake oil. And so, trying to use these supplements instead of actual treatment because they have connected their recovery to not just an oncologist, but their bullshit medicine, is where we wind up here. And of course, the immunologic.org website has a really good article going through all these details, and most notably the whole such and such will cure your cancer when it actually had no relevance whatsoever to the recovery of the individual and the bullshit anecdote attached to it, and from that person when they got better. Instead, something like a doctor made them better. Now, this is not necessarily true in all cases, but in many cases. The caveat to that is that in some cases, a vaccine can prevent cancer. And in this instance, we're talking about treating cancer after it's already there. We'll get to preventing in the first place later, but understand, we're talking about a small clinical trial, which is already, let's say, a red flag. It's not the red flag that you'd find on Tinder, but it's a red flag. And what it does is, it's meant to prevent triple-negative breast cancer, but it's only designed to prevent recurrence of tumours, which means some individual will have been treated for breast cancer, and from what we read here, it doesn't necessarily specify which particular kind, whether it's by radiation, chemotherapy, surgery, etc., but it will stop it from coming back, which is arguably a major weight off someone's shoulders, as breast cancer is a massive fear. The idea that it might return is essentially a 1,000-pound elephant walking behind you, and you just know one day you're going to be stepped on. You just don't know when. The only, let's say, major worry with this study is that it does, for the most part, involve essentially tailoring individual vaccines to each person. But the way they do this is by taking the tumours and finding on them what are called neoantigens. That is, antigens on the surface of the cancer cells that the immune system can recognize and then use. The vaccines they developed had a range of 4 to 20 antigens in use, although the average was 11, which does mean that there's a fairly good chance that you could, in theory, and understand there is a massive red flag next to that theoretical statement, use this as a treatment for many other cancers along with breast cancer. The hard part in doing so is that you need specific software developed by the researchers to be able to select these neoantigens from those cancer cells and then develop the vaccine, which could, in theory, be the massive problem with this entire, let's say, discovery. Mostly because they don't specify whether or not there'll be a license, if it's an open source software, if the software does require a license, but depending on who you are, where you are, and what you're doing, it'll be at a different cost, and so on. One thing that has proven to be remarkably effective is preventing cancer before it even happens, and this is through the HPV vaccine. We know that this has worked for one very simple reason. The number of young Americans who die from cervical cancer has basically plummeted to near zero. Yeah. Understand. The rate of drop, although yes, we do exaggerate to say near zero, has decreased to 38% of its pre-HPV vaccine rollout levels. Yeah. That means 62% reduction in the prevalence and death of particularly young women under the age of 25 who have received the vaccine over 10 years. Now, this is not quite on par with, say, other countries where they've nearly had a 99% reduction, but it's America. We have low expectations. Just 62% alone is already considered amazing. And more so when we're looking at places like South Carolina, Florida, etc., where the degree of medical comprehension, let's call it that, is already, yeah. It's Alabama incest levels of, you understand things. Gardasil is the primary vaccine that has achieved this, and it is arguably the reason why things like cervical cancer have fallen through the floor. And with time, it should get better. and not just because arguably more and more people should have access to it, but theoretically, as more and more people are in a position to be able to use it and pay for it, given America's backwards medical system, more and more people shouldn't get infected. It's essentially a way to slowly kill off a disease by gradually removing more and more of it from people. And of course, different countries are now not only giving it to young women, but young men. This means that both with males and females being vaccinated, you remove both sides of the possible pool for infection. It sounds great, and it arguably is, but there is a big problem with this that's coming up now. In about 2021, the rate of coverage for all young females in the USA was just under 79%, so this meant about 21% of individuals couldn't get the vaccine for a range of reasons. The range of reasons did vary considerably. Some were simply unable to receive a vaccine. Others, on the other hand, well, they had far less reasonable reasons. Whether it's religious exemptions, just being an anti-vaxxer, political, human stupidity, and the list could go on. America is number one in this respect. However, and this is the problem that we're going to bring you to, is that the number, that is the 79% figure that we mentioned, has been going down over time. Yeah, with fewer and fewer young women and men getting the vaccine, but particularly young women in this case, the actual coverage has been decreasing. Admittedly, only slightly each year, but still going down. Fucking Wakefield, the gift that keeps on giving. He started the anti-vax movement on a large scale, and it has just snowballed since. The man should be held in contempt of court and ideally shot for what he's done. In slightly more positive news, at least for those who enjoy haunted houses, apparently they benefit your immune system. Or, the whole idea of nearly shitting yourself or peeing yourself in public means people are so shamed they don't notice they're sick. We're going to assume that this very small study was right in what they've claimed, which is it's beneficial. 22 participants who had low inflammatory markers in their blood went into a haunted house for 50 minutes. They were then confronted with various scary things, your standards, clowns, zombies, people with various weapons, apparently pig masks because whoever did this was a fan of the Saw movies, and so on. When they came back out, there was an 80% reduction in the inflammatory markers in their blood. The next stage was to take 91 other volunteers, and they basically repeated the experiment. Yet they found it fundamentally had the same effect. So we have roughly 110 people, and all of them have found that, you go into a scary place and you get scared, apparently it reduces your risk of having high inflammatory levels. This could, however, and this is perhaps a big catch to what they've done, be because of how the body responds to stresses. That is, your body releases, amongst other things, adrenaline. Adrenaline causes vasodilation. Vasodilation causes more movement of various content of your blood into tissues around it. In this case, you would not be surprised to find a decrease in inflammatory markers because those inflammatory markers have managed to perfuse out of the capillaries. And so, when you take blood, there's just less of it. It's not rocket science. It's actually immunology. But it is still science. And one that we've not seen any particular note that they've been able to mitigate as far as problems go here. There is, however, more reason to think that perhaps the link is stronger than just that they've observed in this scenario. And it has to do with how the body reacts to a longer-term stress. That is, the various hormones secreted from the body when you are stressed for a long time do, for all intents and purposes, suppress the immune system, part of which is the inflammatory system mechanism. This is generally not good for your health, but if the intention is simply to put a lid on the immune system and say, behave yourself for now, it kind of makes sense that intermittently doing so may be beneficial. However, our original theory that perhaps dilation of blood vessels and the perfusion of cells could be better justified by their other findings. That is, in your normal group, that is effectively your control group, primarily lymphocytes, which are your T cells, your monocytes, which are things like macrophages, and a couple of other immunological cells, eosinophils and basophils, decreased. Whereas in your inflammation group, only lymphocytes and monocytes were the ones that decreased. So there's a couple of questions there that really need to be better answered. In sort of medical news, although arguably not really medical news that you could possibly use. It's brain surgery using a .22 caliber handgun for OCD. Now, this is very much likely to get us in a lot of trouble with YouTube, so let us make this clear now. Do not do this at home. It is a case study. Be mindful of the fact that any OCD condition is a psychological condition. You should get professional help. Okay, now that's out of the way. Let's get to the interesting stuff. The individual suffered from severe obsessive-compulsive disorder, and, well, in order to make their OCD go away, they took a .22 caliber revolver and put it to the front of their brain. Their attempt at self-deletion didn't work, but their attempt did solve something else. It made the OCD go away, which presumably made the 19-year-old very happy. The reason that we bring this up is not just because weird, amazing case study, but how long ago this was and some of the impacts it's had since. The event itself was in 1988. Yep, 36 years ago, so for some people you may not have been alive at that time. In fact, given our audience, there's a decent chance quite a few of you weren't alive at that time. But it did lead to a lot of investigation into the relevance of neurology and OCD, and what they found was that in some instances, certain deep brain stimulation can help with OCD. However, in many cases, no. So it's clear that it's far more complicated than just a really lucky shot. And in this case, both a shot in the dark, because your brain has no light in it, and because, well, they had no idea that this is what would happen. Shifting to other weird American news, we have an attempt to deal with, well, obesity, and particularly obesity amongst children, with Philadelphia bringing in what is effectively a tax on sugary drinks, soda, pop, soft drink, whatever you happen to call it in your local terms. What they've done is take a roughly 1.5 cent tax per an ounce, or roughly 30 milliliters, and this means that anything that has, well, 1 ounce of fluid will be charged 1.5 cents more. This is particularly useful as they were trying to see if taxing these drinks more for 2 years would reduce obesity. The answer to that question is no. No, it doesn't. These findings are, let's say, in stark contrast to the actual results that, well, happened, let's say, with regards to sweetened drinks. The prices went up by 30% and consumption went down by 35%, yet obesity did not change. This would indicate, at least in part, that no, sweetened beverages are not the underlying issue. They may well be a contributing factor, but people are not just getting their calories through that, they will be getting them in a range of ways, which means any intervention like this that uses taxation to increase the cost of a product will need to be far more wide-sweeping, unlike, say, tobacco taxes, where taxation on tobacco drives the cost up, and because people can't afford to buy their tobacco products, they gradually smoke less and less, or they start committing crimes. It's a 50-50 split. Although certainly not the intended result, there were, let's say, coincidental benefits. Things like a reduction in dental cavities and, oddly enough, a reduction in adult weight, which would indicate, to some extent, that it's actually adults who would benefit from this tax rather than children. While we're not going to go through every last detail here, it's very important for us to point out that yet again this is another study that has some concerning issues around its diversity and the nature of the findings they're looking into. So, for example, they were looking at medical records based on tax years, which is weird, but okay, it's America, they do all sorts of weird things. They were trying to compare one particular area, where they had roughly 33,000 people, versus areas that surrounded that, with over 200,000 individuals. And so you have problems around the race disparities, a certain amount of age difference, you have issues around the nature of how they collected their data, and of course the findings are just plain bizarre in ways. In other food-related news, rather than health directly, we instead have what is a very clear, let's say, a depiction of the various benefits humanity has gained from the various developments in agriculture. Not just are we talking about farming practices, but the nature of the very foods that we are growing. For example, hybridization, crossbreeding, various genetic growth in the last few years with more and more GMOs being approved, and so on. But of course, you need to account for all of the variables you see here with other things like, say, market factors. A demand for Brussels sprouts will lead to more Brussels sprouts being grown, but if they, until the 90s, tasted terrible, well, people won't grow them. However, if they start tasting nice, well, things change. People will then try and eat them. Now, there are some notable examples here of things that seem to have seen notable and significant improvement. For example, the kiwi fruit had at least 2, if not 3 periods of rapid growth in its popularity. Blueberries, mushrooms, similar scenarios. Even garlic, cashew nuts, and walnuts all had similar jumps. Now, we can explain at least one of these quite easily, and it's very simply avocados. Hipsters became a thing. However, what we can't explain is asparagus, as making your pee smell like a vegetable is, well, just plain odd. In a related bit of news, we have, arguably, benefits in terms of agriculture, and it's a report. Understand, it's a very big report from the European Food Safety Agency, and what it does is go through the major findings of a ridiculously long study they ran. Now, it's not so much a study in itself, it's essentially a monograph, and we've linked you to the shortened version here in the description box. What they looked at was 32 months of work. This had a 180,000 page document generated. That document looked at 2,400 studies. They looked at 90 experts to come in and actually say, look, this is how this works, this is what it does, these are the risks, these are the benefits, so on and so forth. It involved 27 different countries' authorities, and they received 400 entries from the public. Take a guess as to what you think the final result was. In short, glyphosate is fine. Glyphosate works. Glyphosate is not dangerous. And as such, it should continue to be used. Well, no, we should be a little more specific. It's not that it should continue to be used. What they instead concluded was that it cannot be classified as carcinogenic, mutagenic, or have any harmful effects on the reproductive ability of an individual. Or in other words, there is no danger in using it, at least for a human, unless that human happens to be a weed. In which case, yes, you need to worry, but you should also run away from any scientists looking for you, as they likely want to put you in a box and breed you for future research, because whether or not you're human is up for debate at that point. In more environmental news, although this time something man-made in terms of problems rather than addressing a problem that isn't a problem. We have plastic-eating insects coming out of Kenya. No, this is not the start of a horror movie, although given the nature of the bugs in question, kind of looks like it should be. It's a insect in Kenya that lives as a effectively colony-type structure. By that we mean there's a creepy crawly mass of them, and they're native to Africa, which is not that surprising. Parts of Africa are terrifying. But to be clear, Australia is more terrifying, but if you start ranking the continents, it goes Australia, then Africa, and then we have to start working our way through the rest on a far more difficult process. What's important here is the Alphiltobius darkling beetle has a larval period of about 8 to 10 weeks. These larvae are what can break down plastic very well. In fact, they appear to be able to eat through some of the more common plastics. For example, polystyrene. Polystyrene, however, shouldn't be something that ever gets thrown out. It should be easily recyclable, and in fact it is very recyclable. A polystyrene can be reused in one simple way. You drop it into sulfuric acid and it melts. You boil off the sulfuric acid and you are left with solid styrofoam. Easy. But the problem is that it's more expensive to do that than it is to make new styrofoam. And so we're stuck in a world where essentially it becomes a landfill and we need to rely on bugs to destroy it. Although we're destroying other plastics too, so it's not like this is a one-fit solution. The approach at present, or at least the way it's standing up in their research, is that we can't really just grow a whole bunch of these larvae and then turn them into beetles and then keep the cycle going forever. They don't grow anywhere near as well when fed only plastic. Instead, you are better off feeding them a combination of plastic and some sort of nutrient-dense food. This leads to a higher survival rate, a greater reproductive rate, and a surprisingly better breakdown of the plastic itself. This process doesn't just happen overnight. The research indicates that it would take between 9 and 11 months for the sample to be completely broken down, which isn't ideal, but on the other hand, it's a native African beetle, so you're not introducing something new and wonderful, and you're not going to wind up like Australia with the cane toad. Although it does lead to all sorts of entertaining bogan videos, so it wasn't a complete loss. In ancient news, we're looking at archaeology and Egypt, and weirdly enough, what may have inspired the Egyptians to build their pyramids. Hallucinogenics. Ancient hallucinogenics. We're slightly overstating it, but given the History Channel, it won't be that surprising to find sometime very soon. What the History Channel will say is, it wasn't aliens, it was drugs that led to the pyramids, but the drugs were bought by aliens. Well, something like that anyway. In some ways, it's not that surprising to see that these large drugs contained narcotics, mostly because they were of a deity called Bes, the Egyptian deity of music, merriment, and childbirth. They were also occasionally called the giver of dreams. And sure, hallucinations could count as a dream. Despite having discovered a ridiculous number of these artifacts over time, what was in them was always a bit confusing, until now, where it's thought that a large, let's say, vessel donated in the 1980s was studied, and they found 3 plant samples, or traces of 3 plants with no narcotic properties. One being the blue water lily, which is a psychoactive plant. You have another plant called Syrian rue, which is a sedative and hallucinogenic, and the third is the Cleome genus, which is another hallucinogenic. So if one didn't get you, there's a good chance the other 2 would. And certainly it would lower your threshold before experiencing weird and wonderful sensations. Either that, or somebody had to be really stoned out of their mind to drink whatever was in here given the other ingredients. Sure, things like milk and honey aren't so bad, but once you start adding human fluids to it, yeah, you don't know what you're drinking. Other inclusions did include things like, breast milk, spit, blood, vaginal fluids, and, the list does go on. So, yeah, perhaps being stoned out of your mind so you don't remember what you consumed is the better option. In a possibly a drug-induced moment of ecstasy and, eureka, chemists have found a way to essentially deny one of the oldest rules in chemistry, at least one of the oldest established rules. It's about 100 years old now, and it comes from a researcher. Now, the researcher's name, after we butcher it here, is Julius Brett, and he's a German chemist who found in 1924 or thereabouts that you really can't have a double bond in any proximity to a bridge going across 2 carbons. So if you essentially have a carbon in a rectangle shape, made up of 3 carbons on each side, and you bridge those 2 middle carbons, you cannot attach a double bond to it. This basically means the double bond is either going to have to be in the bottom row or on the top row. There's no way to attach it anywhere near the middle. Except now you can. So the German is likely going to be throwing a fit. Different German, but probably the same mentality. That is, the yelling and screaming, and not the killing millions of people, angry German. The catch to this is that unlike a lot of, let's say, naturally constructing molecules, this doesn't work that way. You do need to build it up using a series of structures over time. That is, by using enzymes, chemicals, reactions, and so on, to add and subtract as you need to in a systemized and structural manner, which does work. There is a very well-developed system by Shu Kobayashi to do so. But it does limit, to a certain extent, what you can do because it is rather more labor-intensive. However, and this is the big however, by doing so, you're opening up a world of new possibilities when it comes to chemistry. And not necessarily perfectly so, but definitely opening up massive pharmaceutical options that, at least up to now, were considered, if not impossible, incredibly difficult and unlikely to ever actually succeed. In a related piece of news, we have an article that took nearly 11 years to publish. Now, this is by no means the worst instance of this we've seen, mostly because, well, the worst instance is just when anybody just outright rejects it, but ignoring that, you do have instances where people just don't actually understand what is being submitted to the journal, which has happened a couple of times. It's kind of hilarious, mostly in mathematics, much like this article. The article was submitted on the 14th of June 1995. It was accepted for publication in May 2006. It only became available, at least online, in 2008. Now, to be clear about this, there is a, let's say, notable, let's call it a caveat to this. Not everything is on reviewer number 2. A lot of it can be blamed on reviewer number 2, but a lot of it can also be blamed on the academics involved in writing it. Mostly that, they didn't really take a proactive approach. There were various issues around the requirements they were asked to do. They were asked to make certain changes, and, well, as with most similar papers, it was a lot of work for seemingly very little reward. But, despite all of that, it is still notable for what it is. In other published research news, we have a paper that is weird and interesting. Not so much because it's particularly important, but because of what it is, how it's achieved what it has, and the claims that come from it. Essentially, that using machine learning, they found that economists tend to have notable political leanings, and that those political leanings will grossly and significantly alter how they present their results. For example, the, let's say, more conservative or Republican-leaning and Democratic or liberal-leaning individuals in economics will present their findings in notably different ways, and sometimes not ideally so as a result. The problem does, however, go beyond just the language they use in presenting their findings. The big issue the researchers seem to present as the problem is that certain political leanings, let's say, lead to individuals aligning themselves for certain fields of research in economics, meaning that within economics, certain subfields tend to be operating from the same political playbook, let's say, and this means that certain analyses could be far less unbiased and objective than you would like to think. Now, depending on how the data works, well, you kind of can't fudge the numbers, but this is economics, so it's a concern. The final finding that we want to particularly touch on is that they claim that looking at the most left-wing or liberal researchers in academics in economics to the most right-wing or conservative academics in economics, you have a 77 to 60% shift in their earnings bracket, which is interesting, although it's also economics, so who knows whether or not they're just hiring more liberal individuals because they're cheaper, or more conservative individuals because they're cheaper, somehow. In similar economics-related news, another paper is arguing that, well, a race or particularly skin color is going to be what decides whether or not your paper is particularly successful. They did look at a large dataset, which sounds like it's great. It's over 330,000 publications. The problem is that they're looking at publications from 1950 to 2021. They also did try and see whether or not using CVs from thousands of economists that were documented would help in this respect. They found that, well, no, if you are what they describe as a non-white scholar, that being black, Hispanic, or Asian, you are going to get between 5 and 9.5% fewer citations than a white scholar. Now, our first and most immediate thought here is, yes, but if you go back 70 years, you're also probably going to find that various other things aren't allowed. Like, for example, you will never find a homosexual individual, at least not publicly, being listed. And there are other examples that we could use, but this is a simple case of the window of time they've selected is bad, like really bad. Now, they do claim that this is because researchers tend to cite from within their own racial and ethnic groups, which, not so much. They're jumping to a pretty big conclusion there and missing a whole bunch of bridges in between that they kinda need to check off. For example, depending on the time frame we're talking about, simply accessing information from your non-racial group would be really damn hard. There was no internet in the 1950s. So knowing that somebody on the other side of the world wrote something is really hard to know. In fact, they basically substantiate that entire point by pointing out that simply by reducing the cost of citing research, you could reduce any gap in racial bias by 50%. Or in other words, if you have the modern internet, suddenly people find it easier to find other people's research and cite it. Who would have thought? This, of course, can be mitigated another way, at least according to another study, which says that simply by including your personal pronouns in an email, you'll be able to get significantly better treatment in a higher education institute. Essentially, if you put he, she, they, them, whatever it happens to be, describe yourself in an attack helicopter for all the difference it makes to us, you will get better treatment, which doesn't sound like it fits with a university where presumably the merit of what you do should affect the degree of treatment you receive if you are not being given the same treatment as everybody else. Now, the treatment you will get is several things. First of all, there is a slightly higher response rate at about 4% more, which, depending on the nature of how they've tried to set this up, may or may not be significant. However, the text analysis is slightly more important, where it would appear that including pronouns leads to a far more friendly response. And, well, weirdly enough, the increased use of exclamation marks, emojis, and emoticons. Which, yeah, that's just plain bizarre. We will, however, point out that the error bars in this study are kinda worrying. In fact, they're big. They're not, oh crap, oh crap, oh crap, my entire experiment has failed big, but they're big enough to think, Next we go on to, well, what happens when you tell people that everything is racist? Which is something that, depending on the various places on YouTube, X, and other social media that you've been, is something you would have probably heard. The result of this is that if you then test people on everything being racist, they will find not only is everything racist, but they will attribute negative reasons to everything. Even if you specifically design a particular prompt to have zero indicators of any kind of bias or other factors. It is the most vanilla, neutral prompt you could provide, and yet still, after telling people everything is racist, people find it racist. This, of course, is not that surprising. It's been something that's been known about for millennia, admittedly in a very different context. It was, historically, you tell the soldier that everybody they encounter and are told to kill is bad, they will kill them thinking they are bad. In this case, we've simply shifted the focus from being that they're soldiers to they're university people, whether students or staff, that everybody is a racist, and that everybody should be treated as though they are acting like a racist. Which, yeah, not an awesome idea, especially in a place like a university which should be open, at least mostly open, to people just interacting, not necessarily screaming racist comments at each other like an Xbox lobby, but certainly being far more welcoming and open as a general area than other places in the world, mostly to allow for the challenging of various ideas, challenges that should, if done correctly, allow for the civil discussion of topics. Well, discussion of topics. Civil we're not so sure about. In a related tangent, let's say, it's that females continue to overtake males in terms of graduating from universities. This isn't a new phenomena. It's interesting to see it brought up again, and the rate at which it's essentially increasing, but it's not new. It's been reasonably consistent since the early to mid-90s that more females than males graduate university. What's changed is, to a certain extent, the fields from which females are graduating versus males. Now, stereotype as much as it may be, a lot of the earlier research into this found that females were graduating from certain classifications of degrees, teaching, nursing, similar things to that. The males were more in the STEM field, law, that sort of thing. Over time, there's been a greater blurring of that overlap, let's say, where more females have gone into STEM, law, so on, and more males to an extent have gone into things like nursing. But there are notable exceptions, like teaching, where males just won't touch it, no matter how much you encourage them to do so. It's just perceived as too much risk. This is why males currently make up about 40% of the total US graduates, and females make up about 60% of total US graduates. This does, however, bring us to a encounter that sort of brings this full circle in a way. It's an encounter with an individual who, for all intents and purposes, claims that autism is a behavioral issue, not a neurological issue. We, of course, maintain, as we have from almost day zero of this YouTube channel, that autism is neurological in its basis. The whole impetus for this exchange, we certainly can't call it a discussion, is the argument that you can't test for autism in utero. The problem is, you can. You can literally run an MRI and you have a very good chance of being able to reliably predict not just if an individual is autistic, but the degree of severity of those autistic traits, all related to differences in brain structure from an MRI scan. Now, this was not taken well by a certain individual because, well, first of all, they're arguing that it's a behavioral disorder. The second is that they're basically asserting that the entire condition is their personality and therefore they know what it is, how it is, and why it is. And finally, there's a certain assertion of, I'm a scientist, therefore I know best. Which is kind of weird when you consider that, the people who do know best, that is, the scientists who are publishing on this, know what they're talking about. But we'll address the 3 points in order. The first is, in no uncertain terms, the current body of literature makes clear it is a neurological condition that starts in utero. The primary event that occurs is the front part of the brain has a huge increase in neuronal development. That is, the neurons proliferate like crazy, but they don't get pruned properly. This is arguably part of why certain personality traits are more pronounced, and why, to a certain extent, in, say, Asperger's syndrome particularly, individuals are more than capable of, let's say, outperforming others, but with certain other issues. On the other hand, the backside of the brain are far less developed because of certain changes, and arguably more aggressive neuronal pruning later on. This leads to issues around emotions, interactions with people, and so on, which, autistic traits, they're pretty much 101 right there. That, of course, does mean that we can show, in utero, this is the current state of the brain, that the state of the brain at that time correlates to certain behavioral changes and degrees of change, and then finally, that you can predict based on that. But the response we received at the time was, the individual was diagnosed as an adult. Now, it may be wrong, and we're more than happy to be corrected, but as far as we're aware, this individual is not some sort of ubermensch who has a PhD before they're even born. They say they were diagnosed as an adult. This means that you have a very different set of circumstances from when they were diagnosed with autism versus the entire scenario we're talking about of diagnosing it, or at least predicting it reliably, in utero. And finally, there's the simple fact that we mentioned earlier. They claim that because they are a scientist, they know better what the articles themselves say, which, well, yeah. Let's take one simple quote, for example. In this study, we used retrospective clinical brain magnetic resonance imaging, MRI, and data from fetuses who were diagnosed with autism spectrum disorders later in life in order to identify the earliest magnetic resonance MRI-based regional volumetric biomarkers. Our results showed that MRI-based autism spectrum disorder biomarkers can be found as early in the fetal period and suggested that the increased volume of the insular cortex may be the most promising MRI imaging-based fetal biomarker for the future emergence of autism spectrum disorders. And of course there are a whole range of other various things. So yeah, when you provide a wide range of let's say factual evidence and the response is emotional, it really becomes a problem, and it does demonstrate an ongoing issue of a diagnosis is not a personality, but it does become an issue because if you challenge anything related to that diagnosis, and because it's a personality, it's no longer challenging the literature or the facts, it now becomes challenging the individual, and a lot of individuals don't take well to what they perceive as you challenging who they are from their lived experience. A unlikely event to ever be a lived experience in the, foreseeable future, and certainly in the next 100 years, is neurosurgery on Saturn, which could be interesting. Now, the paper itself is, it is basically about as realistic to challenge this as it is to challenge an individual who thinks that because they've been diagnosed with autism, they're a scientist and they know better than everybody else because mansplaining is apparently a thing. We couldn't question this study ever, despite the fact it claims to be able to conduct 3 neurological interventions on Saturn. Once you start reading it, the very obvious thought is going to be, is this circle 3.0? Because there's no other obvious explanation unless they are incredibly, incredibly devoted trolls. The final news item we have for you is a less news item and more an interesting example of, pointing out some of the weird social things. Particularly how it is to a, in this case Chinese individual, to see Chinese characters tattooed on a, mostly Western individual, by simply writing on themselves the word water. Arguably, depending on where, when and how you are, water may be the most beautiful thing in the world you will have ever seen, but the word water, probably not. That's all we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions we have for you below.